Worried about the cruel behavior of his daughter, the millionaire CEO hired the best psychologist in the country for a secret evaluation. Disguised as a simple employee, the doctor approached the girl. Without hesitation, she humiliated him in front of everyone. "Get out of here! I don't want to see your ugly face." With frightening calm, the man picked up the phone and called her father. The girl laughed, but her smile disappeared when she heard what he said. "Sir, I have reached a diagnosis. Your case is much worse than I thought. And the problem isn't your daughter. The problem is what?" The Innovate Corp Tower tore through the clouds of Manhattan, a monument of glass and steel that was, in essence, a mirror of its CEO's soul, Henry Ashford. Inside his top-floor office, however, the one who reigned with an iron fist and a heart of ice was his daughter, Beatrice. At 28, she was the heir apparent to a multi-billion-dollar empire, a young woman who had never heard the word no, and who confused the fear she inspired with respect. The office, a masterpiece of minimalist design with a panoramic view of the city, seemed more a sanctuary to her own ego than a workplace. Every piece of furniture, every work of art, was a silent testament to the family's vast fortune, a net worth built on Henry's business acumen and his skill in turning capital into even more money. Beatrice, however, saw it all not as a legacy to be honored, but as a birthright, a stage for her contempt for the world that existed beyond her golden bubble. That morning, her irritation was palpable, a contained storm threatening to break at any moment. Her father, in another of his delusions of humility, as she liked to call them, had forced her to participate in the hiring process for a junior assistant position. The idea of wasting her precious time with ordinary people disgusted her. She had already dismissed 3 candidates with a cold, calculated cruelty, delighting in the discomfort she caused. Now she awaited the last one, some Arthur Evans, whose resume she hadn't even bothered to read. The door opened and a simple-looking man, perhaps in his late 60s, entered timidly. His clothes were modest, clean but visibly worn. His face, etched with wrinkles that could tell 1,000 stories, held a serene, almost disconcerting gaze. It was Dr. Evans, the country's most renowned and discreet psychologist, unrecognizable in his meticulous disguise. Beatrice sized him up, the corner of her lips curling into a sneer of pure disdain. This man was the personification of everything she despised: mediocrity, old age, the lack of ambition that, to her, was synonymous with failure. She didn't even invite him to sit. She remained reclined in her Italian leather chair, a modern throne from which she judged the world. The doctor, in turn, remained standing, observing her in silence, his unshakable calm being the fuse for her fury. The lack of reaction, the absence of the fear she expected to see, enraged her deeply. "Look, I'll be blunt," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "I don't even know why my father insists on bringing people like you in here. You're old, poorly dressed, and frankly, just depressing to look at." She paused, waiting for the words to hit him, for him to shrink, to show some emotion. But the man just stared at her, his clear, deep eyes seeming to see right through her, beyond the facade of wealth and power. That was the last straw. His indifference was a greater insult than any cheeky response. Beatrice shot to her feet, her face contorted into a mask of hatred. She pointed to the door, her finger trembling with rage. "Get out of here! I don't want to see your ugly face in my office. Go back to whatever hole you crawled out of, and don't waste any more of my time." The humbled man didn't argue. He just nodded slowly, his expression still calm. He turned his back and walked toward the door. Beatrice smiled, victorious, but before turning the knob, he stopped. Without turning around, he reached into the pocket of his worn jacket and took out a simple cell phone. Before Beatrice's furious eyes, he dialed a number. She heard him say only one sentence. his voice firm and clear, echoing in the oppressive silence of the room. "Henry, it's me. Would you mind putting me on speakerphone, please?" A familiar, tense voice filled the room from the phone. "Doctor? So, how did the assessment go?" Beatrice's arrogant smile froze, cracking and shattering like a thin sheet of ice in the sun. The blood drained from her cheeks, leaving behind a deathly pallor. The word doctor echoed in her mind, colliding with the image of the humble man before her. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with dizzying speed and terrifying clarity. The renowned specialist, the discreet assessment, her father's insistence. It was a trap, and she had walked right into it, eyes open and mouth full of poison. Dr. Evans looked directly into her eyes, his serene gaze now heavy with a grim diagnosis, and spoke into the phone with a surgical calm that made each word even sharper, so that she and her father could hear. "Mr. Ashford, your situation is worse than I thought." He paused dramatically as panic settled on Beatrice's face, an icy knot forming in her stomach. "Your company doesn't need a psychologist. It needs an exorcist. Your daughter isn't just spoiled. She's a well of sociopathy. My professional advice is that you remove her from any position of power immediately, before she destroys your legacy and the lives of everyone around her. My assessment is complete. I'll send you the bill." From the phone, there came no defense, no question, just a long, heavy sigh, the sound of a father's heart breaking under the weight of an undeniable truth. And then Henry's voice, low and resigned. "Understood, doctor. Thank you." And with that, Dr. Evans hung up, placing the device back in his pocket. He gave Beatrice one last look, not of pity or anger, but of distant clinical observation, like a scientist who has just classified a dangerous species. Then he turned and left, closing the door behind him with a soft click that sounded like the crack of a whip in the deafening silence of her own ruin. Beatrice stood paralyzed, a marble statue in the center of her collapsing empire. The air seemed thick, heavy, hard to breathe. The glass walls, which once gave her a sense of power and dominion over the city, now felt like a transparent cage, exposing her humiliation to a world she could no longer see. Her own cruel words came back to haunt her. Old, poorly dressed, depressing. Go back to whatever hole you crawled out of. Each syllable was a nail in her coffin. The legacy, the fortune, the net worth she had always considered extensions of herself, suddenly seemed distant, threatened. She was no longer the heiress, the princess. She was a diagnosis, a well of sociopathy. The intercom on her desk buzzed, the shrill sound tearing through the silence. The trembling voice of her assistant, Clara, came through the speaker. "Miss Ashford, your father, he's on his way up." She didn't answer. She couldn't. She remained with her back to the door, her eyes fixed on the skyline, but seeing nothing. The man who raised her, who gave her everything, was the same one who had orchestrated her downfall. Her office door opened slowly, without the customary knock that always announced anyone's arrival. She didn't need to turn around. She felt his presence fill the space, a silent authority she had never truly understood. His steps on the expensive carpet were muffled, but each one echoed in her soul like a judge's gavel, sentencing the end of the life she knew. Henry Ashford didn't enter the room like a disappointed father. He entered like the billionaire who built that empire from scratch. There was a weight on his shoulders that wasn't fatigue, but the armor of an irrevocable decision. His eyes, usually warm when they looked at her, were cold and distant, like those of an investor assessing an asset that had become toxic. He stopped in the center of the room, hands in the pockets of his impeccable tailored trousers, and watched her back, a rigid silhouette against the vastness of Manhattan. Beatrice felt his gaze pierce her back, but refused to turn. To acknowledge his presence would be to admit her own defeat. The silence stretched, tense as a violin string about to snap. It was he who broke it, his voice calm, yet devoid of any paternal emotion. "I heard everything, Beatrice." She finally spun around, her face a mask of defiance and disbelief. "You're going to believe that? In that vagrant, over your own daughter?" Her voice came out sharper than she intended, a crack in her facade of control. "He was not a vagrant," Henry corrected with surgical precision. "He was Dr. Evans, a professional I hired and paid very well to give me an honest assessment, an assessment I had been putting off for years in the foolish hope that you would change." He took a step forward, his gaze sweeping over the luxurious office. "All of this company, this wealth, it's not just about money, stocks, or the market's performance. It's about people. It's about the legacy I want to leave, a legacy you are actively trying to destroy." The accusation hit her like a slap. "Destroy? I am your successor. Everything I do is to protect our fortune. You protect nothing." His voice rose for the first time, loaded with decades of restrained frustration. "You terrorize talented employees, create legal liabilities with your behavior, and treat anyone you consider inferior with a cruelty that shames me. You confuse our portfolio's profitability with your value as a human being. You think our net worth gives you the right to be a horrible person, but that right isn't for sale. It can't be bought with gold or crypto." Beatrice recoiled as if his words were physical blows. Never in her entire life had her father spoken to her that way. He was her source of power, the foundation of her world, and now that foundation was crumbling. I'm not like that," she stammered, the desperate denial sounding hollow even to her own ears. Henry shook his head, a gesture of deep, painful resignation. "Dr. Evans only confirmed what my father's heart refused to see. I failed you, Beatrice. I gave you so much capital, so many assets, that I forgot to give you what was essential. And now, I have to fix my mistake." He walked to her desk, picked up the phone, and dialed an extension. "Security, please come up to my floor. Yes, the executive suite, and cancel all access for Ms. Beatrice Ashford's keycard. Immediately." He hung up and looked at her. The panic in her eyes was real, primal. "Dad, what are you doing?" she whispered, her arrogance finally giving way to raw fear. "I'm doing what I should have done a long time ago," he said, his voice calm again, but now with a funereal tone. "I'm firing you, not just from the vice presidency. I'm removing you from Innovate Corp, from the board, from all family businesses." He took his own wallet out of his pocket, opened it, and placed on her polished desk not a wad of cash, but a single, simple Metro card. "You have 1 hour to collect your personal items. The company car stays. Your corporate credit cards have already been blocked." He turned to leave, but stopped at the door without looking at her. "Oh, and one more thing. The penthouse you live in is a company asset. You need to vacate it by the end of the week." The sound of the door opening again didn't make her turn. Beatrice remained motionless, a monument of wounded pride, hoping it was her father returning, perhaps with a shred of remorse. But the footsteps were heavy, synchronized. There were 2 of them. When she finally turned, she was met with the impassive faces of 2 company security guards, men she saw every day, but whose names she had never bothered to learn. They didn't look at her with the usual deference. Their gazes were professional, neutral, which was somehow even more humiliating. "Ms. Ashford," said the taller one, his voice respectful but firm, "we've been instructed to escort you while you collect your personal belongings." The word personal was said with a subtle emphasis. A clear line drawn in the sand between what was hers and what belonged to the vast assets of Innovate Corp. For a moment, rage threatened to boil over. She wanted to scream, to send them away, to remind them who she was. But the image of her father's cold, determined face stopped her. The battle was already lost. In silence, she took the small, empty box that she kept in her closet for mail. Her hands trembled slightly as she walked through the office that had been her kingdom. What to take? Her belongings were mostly company assets. The laptop, the tablet, even the luxurious fountain pen on her desk. She picked up a silver picture frame with a photo of her and Henry smiling on a yacht off the coast of Italy, a painful echo of a time that seemed to belong to another life. To it, she added a small crystal paperweight and a bronze statuette she had won for a Young Leadership Award, an irony that left a bitter taste in her mouth. The walk from her office to the elevator was the longest of her life. Every step was a test of endurance. Whispers ceased as she passed, replaced by a heavy silence thick with furtive glances. No one looked at her directly, but she felt everyone's eyes on her back. As she passed her assistant Clara's desk, their gazes met for a fraction of a second. Beatrice expected to see triumph, a malicious smirk on the face of the young woman she had humiliated so often. But there was none of that. There was only shock and, perhaps, a spark of something that looked dangerously like pity. And pity was the one thing Beatrice could not bear. She lifted her chin, the mask of arrogance readjusting on her face, and kept walking, escorted like a criminal from her own company. The elevator descended in a sepulchral silence. In the lobby, the atmosphere was the same. The receptionist, who greeted her every morning with a rehearsed smile, suddenly became fascinated with her computer screen. The security guard at the main entrance held the revolving door for her, a gesture that was not one of courtesy, but of expulsion. Then she was outside. The humid, polluted New York air hit her in the face. The noise of the avenue, a cacophony of horns, sirens and conversations, was deafening to someone used to viewing the world through soundproof glass. She stood there, frozen on the sidewalk, holding her small box of useless memories, completely disoriented. Instinctively, she looked for the Blacktown car and her driver, but he wasn't there. She reached for her phone, the automatic gesture to call a ride-sharing service. And then the memory of her father's words hit her. Corporate cards blocked. But her personal ones, he wouldn't have gone that far. He was her father, after all. The money in her personal accounts, her investment income, was still hers. With a last spark of hope, she walked to an ATM on the wall of a bank. She inserted her personal credit card, an exclusive black card, typed in the PIN, and read the message on the screen. Transaction not authorized. She tried again. The same message. A cold sweat began to form on her forehead. He had cut off everything. The cash flow that had always been infinite had run dry. She looked at the contents of her designer handbag, expensive lipstick, a phone that would soon be useless, and the Metro card her father had left. She was standing on the sidewalk of the richest avenue in the country, surrounded by a wealth she could not touch, without a single dollar to her name. The Metro card in her hand felt like an alien object. It was thin, flexible, insignificant. And yet, in that moment, it represented the entirety of her resources, the key to her immediate survival. Beatrice looked at the stream of people descending the escalators into the subway station, a river of anonymous, hurried faces. They were the same people she used to watch from her window at the top of the world, ants in an anthill that existed only for her entertainment and profit. Now, she was forced to join them. Every step into the station was a descent into a personal hell she had never imagined. The smell of metal, sweat, and cheap food assaulted her, so different from the scent of lavender and leather in her usual environments. The turnstile, a trivial obstacle for millions, seemed to her an insurmountable gate. She watched the others, mimicking their movements with a clumsy rigidity, and felt a wave of heat rise to her face when the card worked and the barrier opened. On the platform, the crush of people was claustrophobic. They bumped into her without apology, absorbed in their own worlds of headphones and phone screens. She, who was used to having spaces open up for her, felt violated, erased. When the train arrived with a deafening roar, she was pushed inside by the human mass, with no chance to resist. Pressed between a burly man smelling of garlic and a young woman with a huge backpack, Beatrice struggled to breathe. The air was thin and stale. She clung to a metal pole, her perfectly manicured nails gripping the cold, sticky surface. The train swayed, and with every jolt, strange bodies pressed against hers. It was then that an old memory, buried under layers of wealth and contempt, surfaced. She was little, maybe 6 or 7, holding her mother's hand. They were on a bus, not a subway, but the feeling was the same. Her mother, Helen, was laughing at something she'd said. The sound warm and genuine. Back then, Henry's fortune was just beginning to solidify. They were still a family that knew the real world. "Look, Bee," her mother had pointed out the window. "See how the city lights look like fallen stars." Helen saw beauty in everything, a beauty that Henry, with his stock charts and dividend reports, stopped seeing, and that Beatrice, his diligent apprentice, never learned to see. The memory faded, leaving a painful void behind. Her mother had passed away when she was 12, and with her, any chance of a different path. Henry had immersed her in the world of business, teaching her about assets and liabilities, but never about empathy and kindness. The train stopped at a station. More people pushed in. Panic began to set in. Where was she going? What was the plan? She couldn't just ride in circles beneath the city. The phone in her purse vibrated. The battery was dying. Desperate, she pulled it out and opened her contacts, her fingers scrolling through a list of names that represented power, influence, and business deals. No one there would help her now. They were contacts of her status, not of her person. Then her finger stopped. A name that hadn't been dialed in over a decade. A name she associated with cornbread, warm hugs, and the smell of wet earth. A name she had decided to forget, considering it unworthy of her surname. Aunt Lucy, her mother's younger sister. A simple woman who lived in some working-class neighborhood in an outer borough that Beatrice couldn't even point to on a map. It was a desperate gamble, a shot in the dark. But it was the only light, however faint, in the darkness that was swallowing her whole. With her phone's battery blinking an ominous red, Beatrice felt the panic suffocate her more than the crowd in the subway car. That name on the screen, Audrey Aunt Lucy, was a relic of a past she had worked hard to erase, a connection to the simplicity her mother represented, and that her father, in his quest for $1 billion net worth, had taught her to despise. Swallowing her pride, which now tasted like ash, she pressed the call button before her courage or her battery failed her. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Each ring was an eternity. She was already formulating a non-existent backup plan when a warm voice, with a faint country accent Beatrice hadn't heard in years, answered. "Hello?" For a moment, Beatrice couldn't speak. The voice was so much like her mother's that it hurt. "Aunt Lucy," she managed to say, her own voice sounding strange, fragile. There was a pause on the other end. "Bee? Beatrice? Is that you, honey?" The term honey made her flinch internally. It was an intimacy she didn't deserve and didn't know how to receive. "It's me," she said, trying to inject some authority into her voice but failing miserably. I need a favor." The silence that followed was heavy. Beatrice could almost hear the gears turning in her aunt's mind, the confusion, the surprise. "A favor? Did something happen to Henry? Are you okay?" "My father is just fine," Beatrice replied, bitterness dripping from every word. "I'm the one who's not. I need a place to stay, just for a few days." She hated herself for the plea in her voice. "Of course you can come," Lucy said without hesitation. The immediate acceptance disarmed her. She had expected questions, suspicion, perhaps even a well-deserved refusal, but she got nothing but simple, unconditional kindness. "Your aunt's house is always your house. Where are you?" With her battery at 1%, Beatrice jotted down the address and directions, 2 subway line transfers and then a bus. When she hung up, the phone died in her hand, severing her last link to the world she knew. The journey to the outer borough was a blur of humiliation and culture shock. The final station was a world away from the financial district. The air smelled of hot asphalt and street food. The shops didn't have designer displays, but colorful awnings advertising sales. She, in her now wrinkled linen suit and expensive leather bag, was an aberration, drawing curious and wary glances. She felt naked, stripped of her armor of wealth. All her skill in managing investment funds and analyzing stock profitability seemed useless in the face of the challenge of finding the right bus stop. Following the mumbled directions of a popcorn vendor, she finally found the right bus. The ride was even worse than the subway, with jolts that threw her from side to side. She looked out the window, seeing a kind of life she only knew from statistics in social reports her company produced for marketing purposes. Children playing barefoot, women carrying heavy grocery bags, men coming home from work with faces marked by exhaustion. It was a universe driven by a different currency, one that wasn't the dollar or the euro, but pure and simple necessity. Finally, she got off on a quiet residential street with small houses and low fences. She found the number Lucy had given her, a simple house, painted a faded blue, but with a small front garden, impeccably kept and bursting with color. It was the antithesis of her sterile penthouse. It was a home. She stopped in front of the iron gate, the small box of her belongings looking ridiculous in her hands. Behind that door was the only person in the world who had offered her help. A woman she had snubbed and ignored for over a decade. Shame paralyzed her. Taking a deep breath, she raised her hand, her heart pounding against her ribs, and knocked on the wooden door. The sound, sharp and final, echoed in the quiet street, sealing the beginning of her exile. The door opened with a soft creak, revealing a woman who was both familiar and a complete stranger. Lucy was shorter than Beatrice remembered, with graying hair tied in a simple bun and the same kind eyes as her mother, now framed by a web of fine lines. For an instant, shock froze her features. Then came compassion, a wave of warmth that dissolved the tension in the air. Without a word, she opened the door wider and gestured not to touch Beatrice, but in a welcoming motion. Beatrice stepped inside, feeling like an intruder in a sanctuary of simplicity. The house smelled of cornbread and lavender, a combination that unlocked painful memories of her childhood. There were no works of art on the walls, only framed photographs of a smiling family she barely recognized. The furniture was dark wood, polished by time and care, not by a cleaning crew. It was a home, not a showroom. "You must be hungry," Lucy said, her voice breaking the silence. It wasn't a question, it was a statement, the observation of a natural caregiver. Before Beatrice could protest, Lucy guided her to the small kitchen in the back, sat her down in a simple wooden chair, and placed a steaming ceramic mug in front of her. It was a sweet, comforting herbal tea. Beatrice's pride fought a losing battle against the emptiness in her stomach and the exhaustion in her soul. She drank the tea in slow sips, the warmth spreading through her cold body. Lucy moved around the kitchen with quiet efficiency, slicing bread, spreading butter, acting as if the appearance of her wealthy, distant niece was the most natural event in the world. They sat at the small table, the silence filled only by the ticking of a wall clock. Finally, Beatrice's dam of emotions broke. "He took everything from me," she said, her voice cracking, anger mixed with a self-pity that shamed her. "Everything. Years of my life dedicated to that company, to growing our net worth, to ensuring the business thrived. And for what? Because of some stupid old man I mistreated. He chose to believe a stranger and threw me on the street like I was trash. He destroyed his own legacy." Lucy listened patiently, her eyes fixed on hers. When Beatrice finished, breathless, Lucy didn't offer words of comfort. Instead, her expression grew serious, almost stern. "Legacy? Net worth?" She repeated the words slowly. "You talk about your father's fortune as if you know what it's made of, but you know nothing. Beatrice, you only know the numbers, The profits, the interest. You don't know the foundation." Beatrice stared at her, confused. "The foundation? My father built all of that from nothing. He's an investment genius." Lucy shook her head, a slow, sad movement. "Your father is a brilliant man with money. That's true. But the first and most important capital, the investment that turned a good businessman into a billionaire, didn't come from his brilliance." She stood up, her eyes misty with a distant memory. "It came from your mother." Beatrice felt the floor disappear from under her. "What? My mother? She had nothing." "That's what your father wanted you to think," Lucy said, her voice low and full of an old pain. She left the kitchen for a moment and returned holding a worn wooden box covered in a thin layer of dust. She placed it on the table with a dull thud. "Your mother asked me to give this to you on the day you truly needed to understand the real meaning of wealth. I think that day has come." Beatrice stared at the wooden box on the table as if it were a coiled snake. The dust covering it seemed to be the dust of decades of secrets. Her mind, trained to analyze balance sheets and cash flows, refused to process her aunt's claim. Her mother, Helen, the woman she remembered as an ethereal presence, too gentle for the world of business, as the source of Henry's vast capital. It was illogical. It didn't fit the self-made billionaire narrative her father had so carefully constructed. Pride told her to get up and leave, to reject this fantasy. But the day's humiliation, the image of her father's cold face, kept her glued to the chair. She needed answers, and for the first time in her life, she wouldn't find them in a financial report. With trembling hands, she reached out and lifted the heavy lid. The smell of old paper and cedar filled the air. Inside, there were no gold bars, valuable property deeds, or stock certificates. There was something far more disconcerting. A bundle of letters tied with a faded satin ribbon, a small diary with a worn leather cover, and underneath it all, a single official document, yellowed and precisely folded. She ignored the letters and picked up the document. As she unfolded it, she recognized a property sales contract. The clauses were simple, the language dated. It detailed the sale of a small farmstead in a rural town in Pennsylvania, a place with a forgotten name. The transaction value, by today's standards, was modest. But the date was almost 30 years ago, shortly before the founding of Henry's first company. The seller was Helen Miller. Her mother, your grandmother, my mother and Helen's, left her that farmstead as her inheritance. Lucy began to explain, her voice soft, weaving a story that dismantled Beatrice's world piece by piece. It wasn't a great fortune, but it was all she had. It was her legacy, her roots. Your father, back then, was just an ambitious young man with brilliant ideas but no money to start. No bank would give him the seed money. Beatrice looked up from the paper, her face pale. She sold it. For him. She didn't just sell it, Lucy corrected gently. She gave him every single cent, not as a loan with interest or as an investment expecting dividends. It was a gift, an act of absolute faith in the man she loved. That money was the capital your father used to buy his first stocks, to open his first business. That farm, your mother's inheritance, was the cornerstone of everything you have today. The revelation hit her with the force of a tidal wave. Innovate Corp, the skyscrapers, the multi-billion-dollar funds, the seemingly infinite wealth, all of it was born not from cold, calculating genius, but from an act of love and sacrifice. She, who had always prided herself on understanding the value of every asset, realized she had never known the cost of the most important asset of all. Slowly, she picked up the first letter from the bundle. The handwriting was delicate, optimistic. "My dearest Henry," it began. Today we took the first step toward our dream. I know you will turn these seeds into a forest. I'm not afraid. For my greatest treasure is not the land I sold, but the future we will build together." Her mother's words, full of hope and love, were a brutal contrast to the venom she herself had spewed just hours before. She looked at Lucy, her eyes burning with tears she refused to shed, her mind reeling in a vortex of confusion and pain. "He never told me. He built an empire and taught me to revere seed capital, but he never told me the capital was her." A pause. The weight of the lie was more crushing than the loss of the money. "Does that mean the first share of Innovate Corp wasn't bought? It was a sacrifice?" Beatrice's question hung in the thick air of the small kitchen, a fragile bridge between the world she had known and the truth that was now flooding her. Lucy didn't answer immediately. She came closer and, with a gesture of tenderness that Beatrice hadn't felt in years, placed her hand over hers. The touch was warm, real, an anchor in the storm. "Sacrifice is a small word for what your mother did, B," Lucy said, her voice thick with emotion. "For Helen, that land wasn't just property, an asset to be liquidated. It was the memory of her parents, the smell of her childhood, the only piece of ground in the world that was truly hers. She didn't trade it for a stake in the business or a promise of future profits. She gave it away for love. For her, the greatest wealth wasn't in the profitability of Henry's future investments, but in his happiness, in building a family. She believed that money should serve life, not the other way around. The simplicity of that philosophy was so profound, it completely disarmed Beatrice. Her entire life had been built on the opposite principle. For her, life, people, relationships were all measured in terms of gain and loss, investment and return. She looked at the wooden box, at her mother's letters and diary. These weren't just objects. They were the accounting ledger of a fortune that couldn't be deposited in a bank. They were proof that the person she had most despised in her memory for her weakness was, in fact, the strongest of them all. The anger toward her father returned, but it was different now, more complex. It wasn't just the fury of being stripped of her power. It was the pain of betrayal. "Why did he hide this from me?" she whispered, the question more to herself than to her aunt. "He raised me to be his mirror image, a shark in the business world. He taught me that the seed capital was the fruit of his genius and hard work. Why lie to me about the true inheritance I received?" Lucy sighed, a heavy sound of old sorrows. Maybe he was ashamed, or maybe, over the years, as the fortune grew into a multi-billion-dollar empire, he began to believe his own lie. It's easier to see yourself as a king who built his castle alone than to admit that the first and most important stone was laid by the queen. Seeing the turmoil of emotions on her niece's face, Lucy gently pushed the small leather diary closer to her. "Maybe the answers you're looking for aren't with me, but with her." Beatrice hesitated. Opening that diary felt like a violation. An intimacy she had no right to invade. But the need to understand, to find some meaning in the chaos of her life, was stronger. With her fingers still trembling, she opened the worn cover. The first page had her mother's elegant handwriting, "Helen's diary, so I never forget the things money can't buy." She flipped through the pages, passing notes about her courtship with Henry, dreams of simple trips, the joy of small achievements. Then, she stopped on a page dated 1 week after the sale of the farmstead. "Today, I handed Henry our family's future in an envelope. He was so happy, so full of plans. His eyes shone brighter than all the gold in the world. He promised me he would never forget where we came from and that he would build a safe world for our children." I believe him, but sometimes at night, I'm afraid that in building an empire, he'll forget how to tend a small garden. The words pierced her to the soul. They were a mirror of everything that had happened. She felt a single tear finally escape and roll down her cheek. With a heavy heart, she turned the page, her eyes searching for the next entry. And what she read made her hold her breath, the blood running cold in her veins. Her mother's handwriting was slightly shaky, as if written after a difficult conversation. Henry made me a promise today, a solemn promise. He swore on my bedside and with tears in his eyes that if our daughter ever got lost in the glitter of money, he would do the impossible to bring my little girl back to the light, at any cost. Those words, at any cost, were not a simple diary entry. They were a verdict delivered from beyond the grave. Her father's promise, made on her mother's deathbed, recontextualized everything. The humiliation, the firing, the forced exile. They were not acts of cruelty, but the desperate fulfillment of a sacred oath. Henry wasn't punishing her. He was trying to save her, using the only tools he knew, demolition and reconstruction. The surgery on her soul was being performed with a chainsaw, a brutal intervention because the disease was severe. Dr. Evans's diagnosis echoed in her mind, but with a new, terrible meaning, a well of sociopathy. Her mother had foreseen it. She had seen the seed of arrogance in her daughter and the corrupting power of the vast fortune they were building, and she had tried to create an antidote, a final safeguard. And that safeguard was Beatrice, sitting in a modest kitchen, stripped of everything. The castle of her anger against her father crumbled, replaced by the ruins of a much deeper pain. Shame. Shame for becoming the person her mother had most feared. Shame for having lived her life as a grotesque caricature of her father's worst aspects, completely ignoring her mother's legacy of love. The net worth she was so proud of managing now seemed tainted, not by how it was earned, but by how it had transformed her. She wasn't just the heiress of a financial empire, she was the heir to a promise, and she had failed at both. Lucy watched the silent cataclysm on her niece's face. She saw the arrogance break, the anger dissolve, and vulnerability emerge, like soft earth after a storm. She got up and, without a word, began to wash the mug Beatrice had used. The soft sound of water and ceramic a comforting background noise to the young woman's inner chaos. The simple, domestic gesture was more eloquent than any words. It was the continuation of life. The affirmation that even after the most devastating revelations, there are still dishes to be washed. There is still a tomorrow to face. With an impulse she didn't understand, Beatrice returned to the diary. She needed more. She needed to understand the woman who had given birth to her and whose sacrifice she had, unknowingly, desecrated. She flipped through the pages until she found an entry made shortly after her birth. The handwriting was rushed, full of joy. I held my Beatrice in my arms for the first time, so small, so perfect. I looked into her little eyes and promised I would give her a world where she would feel safe. Henry talks about setting up trust funds for her education, buying stocks in her name to secure her future. I smile and agree, but in my heart, the wealth I want for her is different. I want her to have the fortune of a kind heart, the luxury of empathy, and the net worth of a soul that knows how to love. May she never confuse the price of things with their true value. Beatrice closed the diary with a choked sob that tore at her throat. Every word was a knife, exposing the wound of her own moral bankruptcy. She had become the exact opposite of her mother's dream. She, who measured success in profit and dividends, who valued people by their assets and status, realized she was the poorest person she knew. The money, the business, the dollars and euros. It was all armor that kept her from feeling, from connecting. Henry hadn't knocked her off her pedestal. He had pushed her out of the armor. She looked at the yellow document on the table, the farmstead sales contract, the origin of everything, the source of the capital, the seed from which the poison tree of her life had grown. A thought, clear and sudden, cut through the fog of her pain. It wasn't enough to know the truth. She needed to feel it. She needed to touch the roots. She looked up at her aunt, her expression transformed. The self-pity was gone, replaced by a fragile but real determination. "Aunt Lucy," she said, her voice firm for the first time that day. "Where is this town? Havenwood. I need to go there." Lucy looked at her with a mixture of surprise and a glimmer of hope in her eyes. Beatrice's question, direct and devoid of any trace of her former ego, was the first real crack in the wall her niece had built around herself. Havenwood, Lucy repeated, the name sounding like a nostalgic melody on her tongue. It's a simple place, Bea. No fancy restaurants, no designer shops. Life is different there. I know, Beatrice replied, her voice a little softer. But it's where our seed capital was generated. It's where it all began. I need to see it. I need to understand. The determination in her eyes was undeniable. Lucy realized this was not a quest for revenge or a way to reverse the situation with her father. It was a search for herself. It's a long bus ride, Lucy warned, though a smile was beginning to form on her lips. And the farm, well, it's not what it used to be. It's been sold and resold many times. The farmland was divided up, and what's left of your mother's property is now a small plot of land where a community daycare operates. A project she would have loved. The information about the daycare struck Beatrice like a bolt of lightning. Her mother's land, the source of her fortune, now a place of care and growth for children. A bittersweet irony, a silent echo of the values her mother stood for. The return on that investment was measured not in money, but in children's smiles. That night, Beatrice barely slept. The small guest room, neatly prepared by Lucy, was a world away from her penthouse. The thin walls allowed her to hear the sounds of the street, a dog barking, a distant rooster crowing, the murmur of neighbors, conversations. The absence of the sterile silence of her old life was almost unsettling, but also strangely comforting. She read her mother's diary until the morning light peeked through the curtains. Every word was a revelation, unveiling layers of a woman she thought she knew, but who now revealed herself to be far more complex and strong than she had ever imagined. Her father's fortune, with all its glitter of gold and dollars, seemed insignificant compared to her mother's wealth of spirit. Helen's reflections on love, family, and the true value of life were a mirror Beatrice had refused to look into, but which now confronted her without mercy. The billionaire her father had become was a distant echo of the young dreamer her mother had loved. In the morning, after a simple and hearty breakfast prepared by Lucy, Beatrice prepared for her trip. Lucy gave her a few dollar bills, her own capital, saved with sacrifice, and a hand-drawn map with detailed instructions. "Be careful, Bea," Lucy said, hugging her tightly. "The people in Havenwood are simple, but they have huge hearts. They can teach you a lot more than any business book." Beatrice nodded, unable to speak. Lucy's hug was the first genuine touch of affection she had received in years, a feeling both strange and deeply desired. The bus ride was long and tiring, a stark contrast to the private jets and luxury cars she was used to. The landscape gradually changed, from tall buildings to open fields, from concrete to lush green. The air became cleaner, the sound of nature replacing the constant hum of the city. Upon arriving in Havenwood, Beatrice felt a strange sense of familiarity. The town was small, the houses modest, but there was a welcoming energy that surprised her. She followed Lucy's instructions, walking down dirt roads, until she finally arrived at what was, according to the map, her mother's old farmstead. In place of a rural property, there was a colorful gate and a handmade sign, "Sunflower Daycare." Children's laughter echoed from within. She stopped, her heart pounding, and watched through the fence. A group of children was playing on a simple playground. A young woman with a warm smile and tired eyes watched over them with affection. It was clear the daycare operated on limited resources. Toys were patched up, and the paint on the small building was peeling in places. But love and joy were abundant. An emotional cash flow that was richer than any balance sheet Beatrice had ever seen. Suddenly, one of the children, a little girl with curly hair and a red bow, tripped and fell, starting to cry. The woman rushed over, knelt down, and comforted her with soft words and a gentle touch. In that moment, Beatrice saw a distorted reflection of herself. She had never comforted anyone. She had never genuinely cared about another person's pain unless it affected her own interests or her business's profitability. The image of the woman and the child hit her with painful clarity. She wasn't just a cold executive, she was an empty soul. And then something unexpected happened. The woman looked up and straight at Beatrice. Her gaze wasn't one of strangeness or suspicion. It was a look of recognition, mixed with a deep sadness. The woman approached the fence, her soft smile fading into an expression of concern. "Beatrice," she asked, her voice gentle and familiar, "is that really you?" Beatrice swallowed hard, the lump in her throat preventing her from answering. She didn't recognize the woman, but from the way the woman looked at her with a melancholy that seemed to carry the weight of years, it was clear that the woman knew her, and perhaps knew secrets Beatrice didn't even dream of. The woman approached the fence, her brown eyes examining Beatrice's face with a disarming intensity. "I'm Anna," she said, her voice soft. "My mother was the caretaker on your grandparents' farm. I grew up here with your mother. We were like sisters." The name Anna meant nothing to Beatrice, but the connection to her mother was undeniable. The way Anna spoke, the sadness in her eyes, it was as if a part of Helen was standing right there in front of her. You look so much like her," Anna continued, her voice thick with emotion. "Not in appearance, but in your eyes. They had the same spark before everything." "Before everything what?" Beatrice asked, her voice a whisper. Anna hesitated, glancing at the children who were now playing closer, curious about the stranger. "This isn't the place for this conversation," she said. "Come back late this afternoon, after the children have gone home. We need to talk." The promise of more revelations left Beatrice in a state of feverish anxiety. She spent the rest of the afternoon wandering the small town, a ghost of a future she never knew. She saw the simplicity of the life that could have been hers, a life based on community and human connection, not assets and liabilities. The wealth of this place wasn't in banks, but in conversations in the town square, in smiles exchanged between neighbors, in the generosity of a people who had little but shared everything. It was an economic and social ecosystem that operated with a currency she was only just beginning to understand: empathy. As dusk fell, she returned to Sunflower Daycare. Silence now filled the space once dominated by children's laughter. Anna was waiting for her, sitting on a small wooden bench under a mango tree. She gestured for Beatrice to sit beside her. For a long time, they sat in silence, watching the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. "Your mother loved this place," Anna began, breaking the silence. "She used to say the land had a memory, that it held the stories of those who tilled it." She turned to Beatrice, her gaze serious. "And she made me promise that if you ever came here, I would tell you the truth, the whole truth, not just about her sacrifice, but about the real cost of your father's fortune." Anna took a deep breath, as if summoning the courage to unearth a long-buried ghost. "It's when your mother sold the farm, she didn't just do it for love. She did it on one condition, a condition Henry swore to uphold, but that he broke the moment the first million hit his account." Beatrice held her breath. "What condition?" "The money from the sale," Anna said, her voice low and heavy with old pain, "wasn't just for his company. Half of that capital was meant to be invested in a fund for this community, to build a school, a small health clinic. It was her dream. It wasn't just an investment in Henry's business. It was an investment in the people she left behind. She didn't sell her inheritance. She reinvested it, dividing it between the man she loved and the community that raised her. The revelation was a mercy blow. Her father's lie was deeper, darker than she had imagined. He didn't just hide the origin of the capital, he stole her mother's dream. He took the money meant to build a community and used it to build an empire for himself. Henry's legacy, the billion-dollar fortune, wasn't just built on her mother's sacrifice, but on a broken promise, on the exploitation of her faith and love. He stole from her, Beatrice stammered, horror etched on her face. He took it all. He said he would make the investment later, when profits were higher, that the return would be better, Anna explained, with the cynicism of someone who had watched the story unfold, but it later never came. The money made more money, and Helen's dream was buried under layers of dividend reports and stock prices. She died with that sadness in her heart, trying to believe in the man she loved, but knowing he had betrayed her. Beatrice stood up, her body trembling with a righteous fury and an overwhelming grief. Everything in her life was a lie. Her name, her status, her wealth. It was all the fruit of a theft. She looked at the daycare, at the peeling building and the worn-out toys. That was the inheritance she had been denied, the inheritance her mother truly wanted to leave. In that moment, at the peak of her life's emotional turmoil, a sharp clarity cut through her mind. The issue was no longer about getting her old life back. It was about honoring her mother's life and legacy. The decision formed in her soul, irrevocable and absolute. She knew what she had to do. It was no longer about herself. It was about justice. It was about rebuilding what was stolen. She turned to Anna, her eyes burning with a new and fierce determination. "He's going to pay," she said, her voice as cold as steel. "Not in dollars or euros. He's going to pay by giving back what belongs to this community, every cent, with interest." The journey back to New York was a silent metamorphosis. The woman who stepped off the bus at the terminal was not the same one who had boarded in Havenwood. The brittle arrogance had been replaced by a determination forged in the fire of truth. Beatrice no longer sought to restore her old status. She sought redemption. Her first act was not to confront her father, but to seek out the one person who, besides Henry, knew the destructive power of her former self, Dr. Evans. Finding him wasn't easy. He didn't have a flashy office or an online presence. He was a man who valued discretion above all else. Using the last of the money Lucy had given her, she hired a modest private investigator who tracked the psychologist to a small clinic in a middle-class neighborhood. She waited for him outside, sitting on a park bench for hours. When Dr. Evans finally emerged, he recognized her immediately. There was no surprise in his eyes, only a professional curiosity. "Miss Ashford," he said, his voice as calm as she remembered, "to what do I owe the honor?" "I didn't come to dispute your assessment, Doctor," Beatrice said, standing up. "I came to tell you that you were right, about everything, and to ask for your help." She then unraveled the whole story. Her mother's box, the trip to Havenwood, her father's broken promise. She didn't spare herself, describing her own cruelty and blindness with brutal honesty. Dr. Evans listened in silence, his gaze never leaving hers. When she finished, he remained thoughtful for a moment. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. "My father cut off my access to everything, the fortune, the assets, the businesses. But the truth is a powerful weapon. I want you to be my witness. I want you to help me structure a plan, not to destroy my father, but to force him to honor the promise he made to my mother. I want him to return the capital he stole from that community, with all the returns it has generated over 30 years. A rare smile touched Dr. Evans's lips. "This is not a psychological matter, Ms. Ashford. This is a matter of justice. And frankly, it's far more interesting." Armed with a plan, they acted. Dr. Evans, using his discreet contacts, called an emergency meeting of the Innovate Corp Board of Directors, including the managers of the company's main investment funds. The agenda was vague, citing only a matter of extreme urgency regarding corporate governance. Henry, intrigued and a little alarmed, agreed to the meeting. He walked into the conference room expecting a financial crisis, perhaps a problem with the stock market. Instead, he found his board assembled and, sitting at the head of the table in her old chair, was Beatrice. Beside her, calm and imposing, was Dr. Evans. Before Henry could explode, Beatrice began to speak. With a calmness and eloquence he had never seen in her, she told the story of the farm, the promise, the community fund that never existed. She didn't use an accusatory tone. She used a factual one, as if presenting a balance sheet of moral debts. Then she projected onto the screen the original sales contract and, next to it, a financial analysis prepared by an expert Dr. Evans had contacted. The analysis calculated what half of the initial capital would have generated over 3 decades if invested as Helen wished, using the same rate of return as Henry's businesses. The number was astronomical, a significant fraction of Innovate Corp's net worth. "This is not an inheritance claim," Beatrice said, looking directly at her father, who was as pale as a ghost. "This is the collection of a liability, a debt this company owes, not to me, but to my mother's memory and to the community of Havenwood." The board members looked at each other, shocked. The story, if it leaked, would be a public relations disaster, shaking investor confidence and the stock price. Dr. Evans then took the floor. "Ladies and gentlemen, what is at stake here is not just the next quarter's profit, it is the very foundation upon which this company was built. A foundation that has been revealed to be, in part, fraudulent. Ms. Ashford is not asking for a donation. She is demanding the rectification of a fundamental error. Cornered, humiliated, and, perhaps for the first time, confronted with the true cost of his ambition, Henry looked at his daughter. He didn't see the spoiled young woman he had thrown out of his office. He saw a woman. He saw Helen's strength shining in her eyes. The conflict was resolved not with shouts, but with the silent click of a pen. An agreement was drafted. A trust would be created in the name of Helen Miller Ashford for the social and educational development of Havenwood, funded with the exact amount calculated in the analysis. The management of the trust would be handed over to an independent foundation, with Beatrice as the honorary, unpaid chair of the board. Her role was to ensure that her mother's legacy was finally fulfilled. Beatrice's story did not conclude with a triumphant return to the world of high finance, but with a quiet journey back to Havenwood. She didn't return in a luxury car, but on the same public bus, carrying with her not a personal fortune, but the promise of one for the community. News of the Helen Miller Ashford Trust spread through the small town like a wildfire of hope. When Beatrice arrived, she was welcomed not as a billionaire's heiress, but as Helen's daughter, the woman whose generous memory was finally being honored. Anna and the community leaders greeted her with an emotional gratitude that was worth more to Beatrice than any annual bonus she had ever received. The first projects were transformative. The Sunflower Daycare was completely renovated and expanded, becoming a model child development center. A modern health clinic was built, offering care that once required long journeys. Scholarships were created, allowing the town's youth to dream of college. The capital, once used to generate wealth for one man, now generated well-being for many. Beatrice oversaw it all, not from a distant office, but from the ground up. She learned to read blueprints, to negotiate with local suppliers, and most importantly, to listen to the needs of the people. Her old business acumen was repurposed. The quest for profitability was replaced by the quest for impact. Profit was measured in improved lives. On a sunny afternoon, a year after her first visit, she was sitting on the same bench under the mango tree, watching the children play on the daycare's new playground. Anna sat beside her, handing her a glass of fresh juice. "Your mother would be so proud of you," Anna said softly. "You didn't just fulfill her dream, you made it bigger." Beatrice smiled. A genuine, serene smile she never knew she possessed. "I didn't do anything," she replied. "I just returned what was rightfully hers. The real asset was always here." Her relationship with her father changed in a complex, gradual way. Henry didn't seek her out immediately. The humiliation and shame were a high barrier. But one day, he showed up in Havenwood unannounced. Beatrice found him standing in front of the new wing of the health clinic, which bore Helen's name. He looked older, the weight of the empire replaced by the weight of his conscience. They didn't exchange many words. He just looked at everything the trust was building and said, his voice cracking, "She was too good for me." It was the beginning of a fragile reconciliation, built not on the net worth they shared, but on the memory of the woman they both loved and had failed to honor in different ways. Beatrice chose not to return to Innovate Corp. Her place was in Havenwood, managing her mother's legacy. She lived in a small, rented house. Her possessions were few, but her wealth was immeasurable. She found a purpose that no amount of money, stocks, or crypto could buy. Her journey of suffering and humiliation had led her to a triumph that wasn't about reclaiming what she had lost, but about discovering what she never knew she needed. She had rid herself of the golden pedestal and found her footing on the fertile ground of altruism and human connection. Dr. Evans's verdict, which had once condemned her, turned out to be her salvation. She didn't need an exorcist, she needed a truth. And in finding it, she not only saved her father's legacy from her own cruelty, but rediscovered the most valuable inheritance of all, her mother's soul, which lived within her, waiting to be found. Beatrice's story became a quiet legend in Havenwood, a testament that true fortune is not what one accumulates, but what one distributes, and that a person's greatest asset is the ability to transform their own ruin into a foundation for the greater good.